Good evening, and welcome to tonight's broadcast of California Haunts Radio. My name is Charlotte, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour or so. And I'm also the owner of the California Haunts Paranormal Investigation Team based out of Sacramento, California. You can find us at www.californiahaunts.org. Let me ask you this. When you get up in the morning, are you one of these people who likes to open the newspaper and read your horoscope? I know I am. And what I like to do is write stuff down off that horoscope or try to remember it so that whatever happens during my day, I kind of make a compare contrast to see how the day went. Are you one of those people? Let me ask you this. Have you ever wanted a reading done on yourself to do a full horoscope, using your birth date and all that? I've had a couple done. It's been pretty cool, actually. Anyway, another thing that's interesting me right now, too, is what's going to happen? We're all taking these vaccines and such, and we don't know what the future is going to be like yet. We don't know if we're going to get put back on lockdown or what's going to happen. Well, I think I have some answers for you. My guest tonight is Astrologer Mark Lerner. He's been on a lot of shows doing some reading, not just doing some readings, but doing readings. And he's pretty accurate. And he came on to talk to us tonight, and he's going to talk to us about how he does his readings, how he gets his information gathered, and what interested him with astrology. So if you guys want to sit back, have a little drink, enjoy the show, that's great. The other thing I got to let you know is that this is a pre-recorded show, and we had some technical difficulties. So it's only going to be audio, so you don't have to look at my face or look at Mark's face on TV or wherever you're looking at. But I think you're going to be pretty interested in what Mark has to say. So without further ado, let's bring in Mr. Lerner.
Hey,
hello, sir.
Thank you, Charlotte. Great to be with you and the audience. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm glad we reversed everything. That does bring up interesting things. In astrology, everything is as above, so below, because what we're talking about is, like, most people know astrology as, oh, this is my sun sign. That's about as far as they can get. Unless you get a reading, you start getting into it, and then you realize when you're born, there's the sun, the moon, there's planets, there's asteroids, there's a whole bunch of things, there's mathematical alignments. So many in your audience will probably have a chart done, or they study it themselves, or they have a professional astrologer. When I say many, who knows what the numbers are now? More and more people are getting into it. But of course, there's many more people who have never had a chart done and only think of it as, oh yeah, I think I'm an Aries, or I think I'm a Gemini, whatever it is. And then they are really shocked to learn, what you mean I have the moon, all the planets and all the signs? Because a whole chart is really all 12 signs, and you're not just one sun sign.
How did you get into astrology?
I came from the East Coast. I was in school at Michigan State University back in the 60s, when everybody's talking about comparisons, the recent pandemic year, and what we're still dealing with. A lot of people look back to 68, 1968, and I was a student then. That was the whole time period. Student revolutions and going on, and that was the death of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, and all this strange political stuff between the Democrats and the Republicans and a third party and whatnot. And I was a reporter at Michigan State. They had a great, it was a newspaper that was winning all these awards, and I just inadvertently got a job there. I was not into writing and literature in high school, but I just walked into their office one day, and they needed somebody to be an editorial assistant. And they actually paid me, and I became a columnist. And at 18, 19, and 20, my picture was in the paper, and I was a columnist. So I had an early life as a writer and a columnist about politics and culture and society. And then I left school, but I came from a medical family back east, so they assumed I'd be a doctor. And then I decided to jump ship, and for various reasons, I wanted to go to medical school at one point after college, but then I started taking some medical classes at Columbia University. And literally on the first day that I took some of these classes to eventually try and go to medical school, I picked up an astrology book called Astrology, the Space Age Science. And it was all about a very fascinating thing that the physicists and scientists, people like Copernicus, he was the first person in the 1500s to say the sun was the center of the solar system. And then Galileo followed that, and he was hounded by the Vatican and so on and put under arrest. And people like Sir Isaac Newton, the greatest scientist before Einstein, all of these people were discussed in this book. And it was really fascinating to learn that they were all astrologers. And when the biographers would write about Copernicus, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, they'd say these were fantastic people. They had one fault: they believed in astrology. And this is the whole history of astrology, that the people who are into it realize how profound it is. And it's very mathematical. And it's basically, again, as I said, as above, so below. We're talking about whoever is born at a moment of time on Earth. You have a horoscope. Again, it's month, day, and year. The time, which gives you what's called the so-called rising sign in the east, and allows the astrologer to create what's called the 12 houses, and where are the planets, are they rising, setting, above, or below. And then each celestial body, sun and moon and planets, represent different archetypes and themes. These different signs connect with one another. You can have oppositions or squares of right angles. It's basically applied geometry that we all took in high school, because a chart is a circle of the heavens, 360 degrees. And then you're dealing with putting these different planets. In ancient times, they would use fixed stars, even if like comets appeared, or a supernova or something that might be added. But in those days, they didn't do individual charting, more like a king's chart or queen's chart. People hear about Nostradamus in the 1500s with his quatrains, and he was both a doctor and an astrologer. And then he became a court astrologer. So most of the astrologers in the past were either working for an emperor, an empress, a king, a queen. Nobody knew sun sign astrology. That didn't actually develop until about 90 years ago. And it's really interesting because it developed in England and the United States from newspapers that were about 90 years ago. Newspapers were a penny or 3 cents, and they were looking for something. How can we get people to buy our paper instead of the rival paper, in their part of town? So somebody came up with, what about the 12 signs of the zodiac? And each person has the sun is in a sign. And that's what really started this craze. There was no sun sign astrology 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And astrology was actually taught in European universities. There's a whole history of where this came from for several thousand years in different cultures all over the world. And now we have software, so everything changes. We're techie people, and we can whip up a chart in a few minutes if you have the programs.
That's interesting, because I know years ago I had a toy that they had sold out the store, and I think it was called the Zodiac,
Uh-huh.
and it was the electronic thing, and you
Yeah.
could program in birth dates and all that. It would come up with these readings. It was fabulous.
Well, the software has developed. I mean, it's just like all these other fields, like with the 24/7 email, iPhones, mobile phones, all the different news. It's kind of a shocking thing for all of our minds and our consciousness and our communications with one another. And for all the technology right now to do this would be mind blowing, not just to somebody 100 years ago or hundreds of years ago, but just to the earlier part of our own lives. And I'm now 70, so I grew up in the age where we had our black and white TVs, and all we could do was wait for color, to show up in the 60s and get, I remember a friend had a color TV, and I was asking my dad, when do we get a color TV? And that was like in the early 60s. And otherwise, I became a news hound. I loved watching people like Walter Cronkite, who had been considered the most trusted man in America because he was a kind of fatherly, grandfatherly figure. In those days, you did have, of course, all the political divides just like now, but not as extreme. And because you didn't have a CNN breaking through with 24/7 news, that was 40 years ago, 41 years ago, that created this wave of like everything under the sun that everybody's thinking about, everybody's talking about, and so on. But at any rate, astrology has been around since the beginning of time, really, because the early astrologers were more of star watchers or sky watchers. But we can go back to Mesopotamia, to the Middle East in particular, um, going all the way back to like 700 some odd BC. You know how people have been talking about Jupiter and Saturn just came into Aquarius together? Well, people have been watching Jupiter Saturn cycles because it happens every 20 years, and they're visible planets if you know where to look. So the ancient astrology was the sun and the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. But before the discovery of Uranus in 1781, that's what changed everything in astrology. Oh my God, there's something beyond Saturn. So when you look at like ancient, or going even back to the 1700s, 1600s, and so on, the astrologers and the people who studied all of that, they had a concept that Saturn was the outermost planet. Stars never moved. They didn't have any motion. They were what we call fixed, and that there was nothing beyond that. So now, of course, with space travel and our telescopes, and we've discovered planets beyond Pluto. We're looking into other solar systems every so often. You'll probably see a lot of your listeners and viewers will hear about, oh, this planet could be support earthly life, and then they'll say something like, and it's only 23 light years away. Well, we'd have to travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second, to get there in 23 years. You know, I mean, like, it's great to think that there's a planet out there, but well, how are we going to get there? You know what I mean? It's not as if you can just, somebody says, okay, I want to go to that planet. It'll take me 23 years to get there, assuming I don't hit a crash into an asteroid. Plus there's cosmic rays. It's a great kind of concept to think life in other places, or even in our own solar system, going to Mars, or something like that, which is doable. But that itself also would take several, like 7 months to get to Mars. And you have to get through the asteroid belt, which are the broken remains of a planet that probably was together billions of years ago.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
But I study, I've started doing podcasts the last couple of years and things on my website. I have 13 podcasts I did on the coronavirus and astrology. Astrology can be used for anything. Okay. In other words, somebody wants compatibility between themselves and a loved one, a parent and a child, your boss, or anybody. You can compare two charts. And it's not just, oh, does Scorpio relate well to Leo or not? It's the whole chart. And we even have software reports that people can order. We have one called Friends and Lovers. We have another one called Simpaticos, or what are called transits and progressions. After you have your birth chart, whenever you're born, the planets keep moving, the sun and moon. So this is what people will order when they go to astrologers. Like, they'll tell me what's, like what you're asking, the question for the world, right? That's what clients would do for me, or any professional astrologer. Somebody would say, what's going on for me for this month? What's going to happen in my chart for the next year? And the astrologer, we have these books, and this will probably look backwards. And I'm not trying to promote it, but let's see if I can get it in there. Okay, here we go. Here, this is an example of like a kind of Bible. It's called the New American Ephemeris for the 20th century. And then there's one for the 21st century. And every page in this has the sun, moon, and planets, where they are in the zodiac and how fast they're moving and what their alignments are. This is what we always used to use, and I still use it for research, and it's important. But now we'll have software, various kinds of software, where it'll only take a couple of minutes. When I started back in 1972, 73, after college, and when I got into it, when I decided not to become a doctor, I had to take 2 or 3 hours, Charlotte, to sit and use what were called logarithms in mathematics in order to draw up a chart, make sure the sun and the moon and the planets are in the right configurations. That if a person said, I'm born at noon, for instance, in a chart, the sun has to be at the top of the chart of the circle, but can't be at the bottom. And if you made a mistake, you would then be able to correct that. Now you just put it into software, month, day, and year, the time of birth, the place, and we have these atlases, and then the chart comes up, and then you can do what are called these cycles, transits, and progressions. You could literally start doing a communication with somebody, a reading, in a few minutes, although it would be best to prepare. And I always get notes. I have people send me their background, career, work, health, What are your hobbies? Have you ever had a chart done before? I've done this for 47 years because I want to do my consultations to help people with their individual issues. Whereas a lot of people think, oh, astrologer, he or she is a psychic, they're just going to tell me my future. That's not the way it works. You have to actually look at the charts, study it, get information from the person. I mean, that's the way I approach it. So I
Mm-hmm.
look at it as, I find it very interesting because astrology, you walk a razor's edge as an astrologer. Here's why. Scientists, even my own dad, although that eventually changed for the good because I did a magazine on astrology for 20 years in the 80s and 90s, scientists and people who are into technology or just particularly science think that astrologers are working with a pseudoscience. It's not real. It's a superstition. It can't possibly be that the planets, sun and moon are influencing us on Earth. It's bogus, whatever. And then the people in religion of whatever the religions thinks you're a tool of the devil. You're right, or you're doing something because with religion, with priests and texts, religious texts and so on, they want you to follow that line of reasoning. So astrologers from the religious side and from the scientific side, again, I feel grateful to be on your show and some different times, and I've been on TV and radio shows and things like that. And I do have my own podcast, my own website and all that, and developed that thanks to my daughter, and particularly one of my daughters has set all that up. But the
Mm-hmm.
thing is that if I'm somewhere and people say, well, what do you do? It's like, I have to know who I'm dealing with before I just sort of say, oh, I'm a professional astrologer. Usually I'll say I'm a writer and I'm a consultant. And then if they ask me further, I'll talk about astronomy. Maybe I'll bring up, oh, I also do things astrologically that's mathematical and logical and based on math and all these rigorous kind of things. And then they might say, oh, great. Can you tell me about my chart or my sun sign?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating to me. And I know you be toot your own horn, of course. And bear in mind too, I'm going to put photos of your books up there. So I'm going to,
Oh,
once I go
sure.
back to edit, so everything will be
Thank
there,
you.
for you for the show. Um,
Sure.
how accurate, when the people come back to you and say, "Oh, you did my chart,
Right.
and it was fabulous." How accurate is it usually?
Well, here's the deal. Okay, a lot of people won't go to the astrologer because they say, I don't know my birth time. And they've probably heard through a friend or just the grapevine that in order to have an accurate chart, you need your birth time. So,
Mm-hmm.
first of all, having the birth time allows you to create the best of all situations because that allows you the specific thing of exactly what was rising, setting, above, and below. And most charts, not all charts, I mean, in Europe, they sometimes will use like a chart that has quadrants instead of 12 houses or what we call domiciles. But most charts that anybody will ever see, it's like taking an apple pie and dividing into 12 pieces or a pizza pie. There's 12 houses and they correspond to the 12 signs of the zodiac with an exact time, and of course knowing month, day, and year, and you need to know the place, longitude and latitude. Then depending on what people ask you, okay, like for instance, let me put it this way. If somebody says to me, tell me about my love life, I basically say, what are you looking for? What are how much are you out there? Are you online, with match.com? How available are you? Because there's no way I can tell a person, oh yeah, in June or something, the sun is moving here, the moon is there, or Venus is going to go here, and you're going to meet your soulmate. Because what I need to know is, like, is this person a hermit that never goes out very much? What are they doing in order to attract a partner? So most people don't understand that part of it. That's why I ask, for instance, for people to write me, what are the questions you want to ask? And they might say, love, travel, money, health, and all these things. And every part of the chart, the signs of the zodiac, the various planets, and these houses and aspects will define in the person's roadmap, which is what a chart really is at birth, your horoscope, kind of here are your skill sets, here are your sort of uh, strengths, here are your weaknesses. So the astrologer can gauge that based on the whole thing that they learn. And then
Mm-hmm.
the questions that are asked you can help them. Most people who I've contacted or who contact me and I do readings, I mean, I guess you never know. If somebody didn't like it or their life changed and they weren't
Mm-hmm.
able to take advantage of things, then you may never hear from them. But I never, I don't think I've ever actually had anybody come back and say that reading you did for me was so off. It's always like, it's always that, even if it's a couple of years, wow, that reading from, I've been traveling, I've been busy, thank you so much for what you did, and it was so on. In one way or another, I don't do anything and I'm not sharing anything unless I feel what I'm saying is going to resonate with them. The other thing is that you haven't asked this question yet, but like if somebody says, I've been really ill or my loved
Mm-hmm.
one has been ill, do you think they're going to die or something? I don't see death in a chart. It's not that you can't see it in retrospect based on looking backwards when somebody has passed, let's say. What an
Mm-hmm.
astrologer would do, what I do, if somebody has passed, you look at things like the new moon, the full moon, very much where we're going to go forward when we're going to get to the point of what's going to happen to the world this year. What are the major alignments? The same thing if with the pandemic, for instance, of course, people are dying every day. A couple 100,000 people around the planet from whatever accidents, illness, natural causes. And then more people are being born. It's a very interesting thing to think of the statistics of how we're getting 7 billion people, 8 billion people, what's going on, why are we increasing the population? But now with
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic, right, with this kind of pandemic that has taken off in such a challenging and difficult way for the planet, people are thinking even more about how, is there anything in the stars or is there anything with major planetary alignments that can make this worse or not? And again, I've done 13 podcasts. People can look at that when they go to the website. I haven't done one recently, but I'm constantly updating my research about that. When did it start? Where did it start? Like in Wuhan, China. What was the time period? What is the chart for China? Every country has a chart. Every state of the union, whether it's Arkansas or California, where you are, Oregon, where I am, every state actually. This may sound weird to people, but even states of the union have a chart based on when they entered the union, which was a specific day and a specific time that our government in Washington, D.C. said, okay, remember when Hawaii and Alaska entered the union? I mean, that was like 1959, 1960.
Mm-hmm.
So those were the two most recent states. So I can even do readings. Let's say somebody comes to me, I don't know if I'm living, in this area. I don't seem to be getting along with my friends or in this community. It's possible that a person, you could look at their horoscope and then compare it to, say, the state chart of California, which is September 9, 1850, at a specific time of day. I mean, it's that specific that you can do that. Now, very often, because you're dealing with a bunch of planets and so on, you'll find reasons why, say, for you, if we looked at your chart compared it to California, we'd find reasons why you're doing what you're doing and you're happy generally with what you're doing in California rather than, say, Arkansas. I mean, it may be that you're born in California, this is where it's all developing. But
Right.
if I'm just saying you or a person who's doing what you're doing, if you became dissatisfied, it could be the timing in your life. It could be a cycle, have nothing to do with the state of California, nothing to do necessarily with your own chart, but that it's time to move on and do your thing somewhere else. Like Elon Musk just suddenly decided, aside from investing in Bitcoin and all this, hey, I'm going to move over to Texas. And when he went, well, he's in the process of moving. And then they had that ice storm, and now he wants to, I guess. And I'm not in. I don't own any Bitcoin, so if that is a question. I'm in researching all of that, so I'm not promoting it or not. But what I mean is that we have all of this movement and all this change. And I just did a podcast on his birth chart because of him being such a rich person now, doing the thing with going to Mars, Tesla, electric vehicles, and so on. And he's actually very connected to Nikola Tesla from, who was born in the 1850s.
Mm-hmm.
That's not actually a fluke. And there's a reason why sometimes people will, from a reincarnational standpoint, which I believe in very strongly. And again, that's probably a lot of what your work is, what's going
Mm-hmm.
on with
Right.
invisible, entities, what happens between life and death, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and I've studied this a whole lot. my loved one of nearly 28 years passed a few years ago, had health issues. It was before the pandemic. But the thing is, we had a book in her bedroom, and we never read it. And it was called "You Can Never Die," written by a Canadian, and it had a dove on it. And as soon as she passed, I started reading it page after page. It was all about ghosts. It was all about hauntings. It was all these documented stories for several hundred years from all over the world, fascinating kinds of things, as well as um, the dream state, out of body experiences, apparitions, things about the soul and the spirit, near death, and it was a fantastic experience. I got the book a long time ago. It was actually sent to me complimentary because I was a publisher and a consultant, and the book was sitting there all the time. And I never wanted to think about her passing, but when she passed, I've been exploring this kind of stuff that you're a professional about and that you're researching. I mean, I've been into that, so that's why I found it intriguing to want to be also on your show and be thankful to be invited, because it has been, I mean, always been exploring this for over about 50 years about reincarnation. I got into the Edgar Cayce teachings and all kinds of esoteric philosophy. Lived at Findhorn in Scotland, which is an amazing community. That was back in the 70s. And I've worked for an organization called Lucis Trust, where they do a lot of work with meditation and all kinds of spiritual philosophy and world goodwill. And they're still in existence, but I did that back in the 1970s.
That's fabulous. I had a question really quick.
Yeah.
You always hear these things about Mercury being in retrograde. What's all that about?
Oh boy. Oh boy. This is podcast 25. I will do one little promotion. I have written about Mercury retrograde and all the retrograding planets for a long time. This is one of the worst areas of astrology. I feel not only am I an educator about astrology, and I did have a magazine about what we call the mundane or Earth astrology. Again, new moons, full moons, the charts for world leaders, major planetary alignments that have nothing to do with individuals, have to do with nations, the world, whether we're all getting along, nuclear war
Mm-hmm.
and peace and whatever. So the thing is that what happens is we're on the Earth, with 93 million miles away from the sun. The astrology that we use on Earth is what we call geocentric or Earth oriented. However, there's even a heliocentric astrology, believe it or not, that's a separate whole thing that not too many people work with. It's using the perspective of the sun. I actually, on my programs, I can create a heliocentric chart where there's no sun sign, there's an Earth in that chart. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
in our charts, the Earth is sort of at the center of the chart. It's just assumed. And then the sun is in the sky, and the moon, our satellite, and all these planets. What happens is every so often, because we're 93 million miles away, not just Mercury, but every single planet, whether it's Venus, our closest neighbor, or Mars, the second closest, or Pluto, 3 billion miles away, or these new planets we've discovered beyond Pluto, there are many of them now in the sort of outer reaches of our solar system: Eris, Sedna, Quaoar, the list goes on. We keep, with our telescopes, we're finding other bodies. Every single celestial body will appear every so often to go in reverse in the zodiac. Now, are they really going in reverse? From the sun standpoint, everything's going forward if you're on the sun, which we're not on there. So in astrology, we have this phenomenon, which is an illusion, but it also has an influence. And what it is, the reason the Mercury retrograde has become so popular is it happens 3 times a year for about 3 weeks at a time, whereas no other celestial body will do that. In other words, Venus every year and a half will go in reverse for 6 weeks. Astrologers know very well about the Venus retrograde. Mars will do that every 2 years for about 80 days. But Jupiter and the outer planets, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and anything beyond Pluto, they're going to go retrograde 4 to 5 months out of the year. It's part of retrograde motion, is part of the solar system structure of Earth, where we are versus the sun, and so on. Now, specifically though, Mercury retrograde. So astrologers have come up with this thing. It's bad, you lose messages, you lose luggage, don't sign agreements. I can't tell you how demoralizing it is as a professional astrologer. I laugh about it, but it's kind of a serious thing. When Mercury goes in reverse, suddenly the orders are stopping. Now orders can stop also when Mercury goes forward, but there's a thought form that's been created in people who get into astrology, and this is perpetuated. Like every time somebody gets into astrology, this happens. Like you'll ask me a question. What I did in podcast 25, I had written about, see, the United States has a chart for our Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. That's the birth of the country. Most astrologers agree on. Some will use another date, like the Battle of Lexington and Concord or the Constitution. But fundamentally, most astrologers in America, around the world, accept July 4th, 1776. That makes us tick. The sun is in Cancer, the moon's in Aquarius, and so on. Mercury is retrograde. The United States came into being with the Declaration of Independence and freedom and all this stuff, and Mercury was in reverse. Now, how bad could that be? I mean, our country didn't fall apart. Sure, we have communication issues, but we also have, for instance, the New York Times, that a former president would always say the failing New York Times, began in 1851 in September when Mercury was retrograde. So I wrote about all of this to disprove that Mercury in reverse is bad. It's not that Mercury retrograde doesn't change things. It's a reminder when Mercury's retrograde, or Venus, which is more related to love and friendship and creative artistry, each planet has a meaning. Mercury does have a lot of rulership over communication, transportation, business, also a lot of stuff having to do with health and medicine, and many other things that Mercury is in charge of. So when it goes in reverse, it's actually retrograding planets, to make everybody aware, are more powerful in their own principles when they are in reverse. And the reason for that, at least the way I see it and my teachers, is that the sun and the moon are always going forward. That's the structure of the solar system. The sun doesn't go backwards, okay? The moon doesn't go backwards. It's our satellite. Only planets, asteroids, or whatever is out there, they will, anything that has a position in the orbital area, like Mercury, first planet from the sun, then Venus, second planet. Every one of the planets, because we're in a skewed situation on Earth, will have these retrograding motions. When those planets go retrograde, guess what they're doing? They're not going forward. And forward means the moon and the sun are two lights, which are the main two power energies of any person's chart. So if Mercury's retrograde, that's actually Mercury saying to the sun and moon and all the other planets, look, I'm going to get off into my own world here for a while. All these Mercury things, I need to sort of strengthen, I meaning Mercury, and then eventually I'll rejoin all of you. It's like if you were in a group of kids, right? And one kid wanted to look at a frog or something, and everybody's saying, what are you doing? Oh, I'll catch up with you guys. Then they go forward, right? Well, to those forward moving kids, every time they take a step forward, it looks like the kid who's sitting there with the frog is going further and further away from them. It's an illusion. Then eventually, when he's done looking at the frog, this is just an example, I've never used it before. Okay, I'm done. And he starts running and he catches up with the other ones, and eventually they're all together. That's sort of what happens with retrograde. But to say that the kid looking at the frog, we're going to blame him for all the problems, that's what people do. And believe it or not, on a Chicago fire, because I've been as a kid, we used to watch all this television. I still have favorite shows that I watch. On a Chicago fire episode a couple of months ago, they had one of the characters twice. This was before the show, when it said Chicago Fire, right at the beginning, when they're just introducing the thing. In the firehouse, twice, because there were problems going on, the female character said in a snide way, Mercury retrograde. And then they did this twice. It's gotten that much into our culture that Mercury retrograde is bad. It isn't. But it does mean that we have to kind of slow down, think about what we're doing, be as sharp with our communications, because that planet it's like the kid looking at the frog and needs to catch up with the other kids. It's that the planet is doing something different, but it's not that it's going to cause us to make all these mistakes. It happens about 17% of literal time. That means 83% of the time Mercury's going direct. Now, every single day when Mercury is direct, there are messages are lost also. Luggage is lost. Problems are happening. So to blame Mercury retrograde in that way is just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, I think it's the
that's what
timing.
I
I
want
mean, the stuff starts going wrong, and if
to.
if Mercury's in retrograde, that's like you said, that's what they're going to blame it on. It's like Murphy's
Exactly.
law, right?
Right.
Something goes wrong. What do you say? What's Murphy's law?
Like, this is a natural thing with human beings. This is what I don't like about it. And this is the funny thing for me. I'm a sun sign Pisces, which is generally considered, starry-eyed, sort of off in the ethers, as the last sign of the zodiac. Doesn't have a reputation like a Taurus or Virgo sun or Capricorn, the earth sun signs. And again, the sun sign is a big part of one's character and our light and our power and our strength and living in the moment and things like that. So if you're born in an earth sign, that's going to be generally a practical part of your personality. But if you have some other signs like water signs, then you may be more into emotion, and air signs are more intellectual, and fire signs are more gung-ho and assertive. But it depends on what's in those signs. Same thing when we get to the thing of what's happening, 2021,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. What we do is we look at new moons, we look at full moons, what are the signs being emphasized, and what kind of conjunctions or alignments, like the Jupiter Saturn that just came into Aquarius. It's not the beginning of the new age, but we haven't had a Jupiter Saturn conjunction in Aquarius since 1405, which is what, 615 years ago. And that's the other thing, is that which is a lead into what you're talking about, or what I guess we'll focus on. We have Jupiter Saturn conjunctions every 20 years. I said earlier, they've been monitored for hundreds of years, all the way back before the time of Jesus and so on, back to about 700 BC. We'd know more about all this if the Library of Alexandria wasn't burned to the ground a couple of times back 2,000 years ago, because that would have been amazing. What would have been there about Atlantis, about ancient civilizations, Stonehenge, the Sphinx, whatever, all these things that, we've lost touch with, different cultures and different ideas about religion and life after death or before death, and, things like that, and shamans and mentors. I mean, it's just fascinating the amount of information we've lost. But what happens is the Jupiter Saturn cycles go about 180, almost 200 years in one element. Now we have Aquarius, then in 20 years they'll come together. Jupiter and Saturn will be in Libra, and then 20 years after that in Gemini, and then 60 years from now again in Aquarius. So between now and the 22nd century, Jupiter, Saturn are the largest planets. They have a lot to do with the main things that people want to do and be a part of and be successful with, because they're the bigger planets. The fact that they're in air signs is why we're into all this virtual stuff, Wi-Fi stuff, Bitcoin stuff, communications, technology, inventions, new ideas all over the place. But from 1841 to 2000, except for an anomaly with Jupiter and Saturn in Libra, this was time of Ronald Reagan coming into power and all of that. But 1841, 1861, 1881, all the way through 2000, Jupiter and Saturn were coming together in Earth signs. So what happened was Earth, in this case, represented banking, the dream of owning your own home, materialist type things, the power of money, ownership, the things that we value that are tangible, right? Gold, silver, diamonds, jewelry, having a boat, having an RV, owning stuff. And we're moving from materialism to mind thinking and the Aquarian dispensation, which is a different thing. The age of Aquarius has to do with the earth and the cosmos and the what are called the constellations. It's these 2,000-year cycles. It has to do with our spring times in the northern hemisphere and which constellation is energizing. We've had Pisces, the stars of Pisces have done that for about 2,000 years, and now we're going into the stars of Aquarius. That's a different thing than Jupiter and Saturn are in Aquarius, what we call that zodiacal sign. That represents a turning on of some of these Aquarian things, but it doesn't mean automatically, we're in the new age.
Let me ask you this. I know people that read their I almost said religious. That I know people that read their horoscopes religiously, and
Right.
I know people that swear by them and will do whatever's in there. Do you see a lot of that where people are after you do a reading for them, that they do that where they will not veer from whatever's in that reading?
Well, see, what I developed at the center of my magazine, my dream was to create an astrological newspaper, which I did create. It was called Welcome to Planet Earth, and started in the early 80s as a newsletter, and then became a newspaper in 1982. And then because bookstores didn't want to carry it as a newspaper on their racks, they said, if you make it into a magazine, then we'll carry you. So in 1987, and for the next 13 years, we were a magazine. And I had all kinds of astrologers working in this field, which is not so much personal consulting. It's what we call mundane or earth astrology.
Mm-hmm.
World leaders, new moons, full moons, the beginning of seasons, major things that were happening, comet, hail bop, whatever it is, these stories that were affecting different, also environmental themes and metaphysical themes, where the astrological principles, so like Jupiter represents hope, whereas Saturn traditionally is more of fear. And it's not always that Jupiter is all good and Saturn is all bad. But every planet has various numbers of archetypes and themes that we can use to the best of our ability. So no chart is ever good or bad or anything like that. You have to discover what is the person utilizing, how well are they utilizing the planets. And that's what I try and help them with when I do readings, is like, if somebody's had a lot of hard times or difficulties, I'll look at certain planets that may be configured in a challenging way in the chart and say, why don't you try these other things? Because Jupiter is really representing providence and benevolence and the power of positive thinking. And if a person, say, a negative thinker, or they don't have enough self-confidence, based on what people tell me, I can sort of figure out if the planets in their chart are working on a low, middle, or high level, and I try and help people to sort of figure that out. I don't know if I answered exactly what you
No,
were.
yeah. Because in other words, it's a guide. It's a guide for people to look
Right.
at and say, well, yeah,
Yeah.
I can go this direction with this, or go this direction with this, but kind of use, for like I say, guidance essentially.
Well, what I developed at the center of the newspaper magazine was something called the Cosmic Calendar. And that's the thing. My daughter created an app, and it took a lot of work to do this. I've been writing about it for 40 years. What I write about, and people can get it for free on their iPhone or mobile phone, is called Astrology Cosmic, third word calendar, but calendar with the letter K. Because the word calendar that we use with a C actually goes back 2,000 years to Latin, where it was called the calends. It's very interesting how I found this out. That's why for 40 years I've called my daily forecast of the sky cycles the cosmic calendar with the K, because first of all, calendar, as you know, like in English, you have a word like cat, it's the letter C, but it has a hard sound. But if you
Mm-hmm.
say celestial, that begins with C, it has a soft sound. C, the letter C is an interesting letter. And I've studied numerology, and I've studied alphabets, and I've studied the power of letters and the quality of letters and numbers. So it all fits into astrology, and your name and your birthday. It's amazing, different stuff. We even have one of our reports is a numerology report for people that is not really astrology. All the rest of them are astrology. But people can subscribe for free to get started one day at a time for this cosmic calendar, where I write it this user-friendly thing. Where's Venus? Where's the moon? Positive alignments, negative alignments, opportunities and challenges, and I give specific times. Fortunately for folks on the West Coast, is everything I do is in Pacific time, but all you have to do is adjust. You can, if you're living, say, in the Eastern time zone of the United States, you add 3 hours. If you're living in London, you add 8 hours, because you're so many hours forward or backwards from Pacific. But I've been doing this, and that's the way. See, what you asked was more about people looking at something religiously, you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
following their horoscope. But now what I'm doing, there have been other people who have done that. But what I found when I was younger, and I came up with this when I was basically 31 years old and started my newspaper to do at the centerpiece, the Cosmic Calendar, was there were what we call magazines. I think they may still be in existence at the grocery store, like Dell Horoscope and American Astrology. These were these monthly kind of things that were mostly sun sign oriented. And you got to the back of these magazines. These were the things that a lot of people might buy. You know, Dell has what do you call crossword puzzles? You know, that company. You know, like when you
Right.
go to the
Right.
grocery store, they have those little magazines and things. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not just Newsweek, Time, and Oprah, whatever it might be. Because now there's a profusion of magazines, but they're always the smaller ones. Like now you'd see Sudoku, right? Or your crossword puzzles or whatever it would be. Well, there was always two astrology ones, and they go back many decades. So they were sources for sun sign that was more elaborate than those newspapers, I would say. Like, we're again, even now, you can still
Mm-hmm.
find many newspapers. They'll hire a columnist, and a lot of famous astrologers did that. There were people like Carol Ryder, Sidney Omar, Jean Dixon, who was a psychic. They all did these things. They were the ones who were hired, right? Because they were famous, particularly in America or England, wherever they were. They were already doing books and other things, deeper levels to their clients, but for the public, they did the sun sign thing. Why? Because they made money. They were being paid for it. So that the religious following or that fervent following is really that people have gotten co-opted into something that newspapers and magazines did, which isn't the real deep astrology. So
Mm-hmm.
as a professional astrologer, I decided I wanted to do the cosmic calendar as the centerpiece. Why? Because like if your chart, maybe in the future we do your chart. Maybe I don't advise that necessarily to show your chart, but we could take Elon Musk, or we take Jeff Bezos, or Bill Gates, or the president of the United States, or the vice president Kamala Harris. Anybody, right, left, center, it doesn't matter, entertainment, or somebody from the past. We could put up their chart. That chart was the sky cycles, what I called the cosmic calendar, at that moment of time in that place. All of us, this is the thing that is hardest for a lot of people to say, why do I need to study the cycles in the sky? Well, guess what?
Mm-hmm.
That's what your chart is. But because we are in the kind of selfie generation, what happens is people do what you're saying. This is my sun sign. I've studied it. It's so true. This is what I'm reading every day.
Mm-hmm.
Or I get this magazine. They talk about my week ahead or my month ahead or whatever it is. And I'm trying to educate people that you're much more than your sun sign. Actually, people are more their moon sign than their sun sign. I was like, what? And there's a reason for it, because the moon is the closest body to the earth. And so the moon in astrology is more of your personality, your moods, your feelings, your connection to your mother, to home, to roots, even to reincarnational patterns. The sun is more like what you're trying to grow into and what you're trying to evolve into, in terms of it's the only body of real light and energy. So it's very profound. And this is why sun sign astrology is developed. So the moon is kind of our instincts and also connection to the past and our home and our family and all those things, as well as constantly how we express ourselves in our moods and our feelings. The sun is not necessarily our moods and our feelings. That's what the moon is, and the moon sign. And then the rising sign, which is in the east, where the sun would rise on the day of your birth, that's considered more of your window to the world, your future. It would be like driving on the highway. We've all been in the highway driving, either ourselves or in a passenger seat. And it's kind of like, as we go forward, everything is flowing behind us. And you know how the story of, you see the commercials with the kids saying, when will we get there?
Mm-hmm.
Daddy, mommy, when will we get there? It's like, pipe down, we'll get there. We'll let we'll stop at McDonald's or whatever it is. It's going to be a couple of hours. Entertain yourselves until we get there. Well, that's kind of like the rising sign, our window to the world. It could be any one of the 12 signs. And that changes about, in the United States, every 2 hours approximately. Sometimes a little longer, depending on which sign, sometimes an hour and a half, sometimes 3 hours. But every
Mm-hmm.
couple of hours, one or another of the 12 signs are rising. Unless a person gives a birth time to an astrologer, we can't tell them what their rising sign is, and we can't figure out what's rising, setting, above, and below. That's why we need the time of birth.
Wow, that's incredible. And I know you got this stuff pretty well software and computerized. How long does it take you to do an in-depth chart on somebody?
Well, like I said, the way I do it,
Mm-hmm.
like somebody orders a consultation. usually because it's not just a question of whether I'm booked up or not. I'm still writing the cosmic calendar. And so I've just been writing for April of 2021, which where my daughter will then put into the cosmic calendar. And instead of being 3 weeks ahead, will be 5 weeks ahead. So that's a subscription that people would get if they decide, anybody listening on this show or in general on my website or wherever I might be, and they decide to get into the cosmic calendar, they get it for free. And then, wait a minute, I want to be able to look ahead to tomorrow. That's not free because the whole idea of the cosmic calendar is to make appointments, to be able to go ahead a week or several days. Oh, I've got a doctor's appointment. I'm going to be visiting my friend. I'm going to be traveling somewhere. I wonder what it's going to be like 3 days from now, 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now. So that we've made that much less. And because things are more out there with social networking, like it used to be, as an example, it used to be $85 was, I think, the highest thing I charged for a year of the cosmic calendar every day, but you get it for a couple of weeks in advance. That was $85. Now it's $49.99. And then I offer some kind of freebie on my website with a report or something to encourage people to get into it because I know how valuable it is. So I try and write all of these things as creatively as possible to make, but I won't just say it. We never have like one day where everything in the sky is all fabulous, and we don't have things that are all terrible. There's always a combination. But when I do write each day, while I may alert people if it's kind of a difficult day, there's too many cross purposes, like let's say traditional challenging planets like Mars and Saturn were always considered more negative than Venus and Jupiter. Let's say Mars and Saturn are square, making a right angle of 90 degrees, or they're going opposite. Those things don't happen all the time. So they're relatively rare. But when they do happen, that's when often things like Mercury retrograde, supposedly, things can go kafooey. People can get angry and so on. For instance, the Jonestown situation that happened, the terrible tragedy back in 1978, happened exactly on the day of a Mars-Saturn right angle square. Now, that's looking back on it, happened in Guyana with that whole thing that maybe many of your folks listening, if they're old enough, they know about what happened and the whole history of that. If there was an astrologer like Leo Ryan was this person who lost his life, one of the representatives from California. There's another gal who is still representing California, and she was actually shot several times and has survived. And she often gives interviews. This is now 42 years ago. An astrologer might have said, hey, don't go down there on that day. Mars and Saturn are square, and something could happen. In many ways, that's a good example of how things can go wrong, where the astrology was available, let's say. And, let me put it this way. You've heard of Jean Dixon, right? Do you remember Jean Dixon? Okay. So Jean Dixon was an astrologer and a psychic. And a lot of people might have said, oh, she's weird, or, who knows. But if somebody had gone to her for a reading, she might have been right on. Well, the thing is that when in the summer before President Kennedy lost his life, which was a big area that I started studying, I was 13 at that point, and that sort of changed my life. And I've studied his chart and the chart of his assassination, and combined all of that. There's still an article on our website in our section called Earth Aquarius News, all about JFK, called "The Wound That Never Heals: America's Turning Point of the 20th Century." But in that summer, there was a total solar eclipse. It turned out that total solar eclipse in July of '63 was exactly on the planet Saturn at the top of JFK's chart. Jean Dixon, who had already predicted years before in Parade magazine, she had a vision of a dark-haired Democrat winning the presidency. This was like in the mid-50s when Eisenhower, the Republican, and Richard Nixon were in power. She predicted that a young, good-looking Democratic person would come out of somewhere, she didn't name who it was, and become president. Now, that was a prediction that wound up being true. So Kennedy became president, and then in that summer, I guess she was still looking at all that stuff. She had a vision, and the vision was that something terrible was going to happen to JFK. This is a story that this is interesting because of, again, the topics of death and ghosts and hauntings and so on. because I feel the whole country is haunted by the death of John F. Kennedy. And right after that, when we got Lyndon Johnson, the Vietnam War started, and we've been on the wrong track ever since. And I'm not saying JFK was a perfect person. We know he wasn't. But we still don't know 57 years later exactly what happened for other reasons that we don't, want to get into, deep state, CIA, FBI. But the point is, we all know that we have never been told the truth about so many things, right? Well, so back to this little story. She warned the White House. She had a vision of the flag, that there was a flag over the White House at half mast, which is symbolic now of somebody dying.
Right.
She called the White House, the phone lines. They thought she was weird. They never recognized. And then when JFK went to Dallas that day, they did all these things, as people may know. The Secret Service said, okay, you want to take the bubble top off? It's a beautiful day. Great. All these different things. And meanwhile, in Dallas, they loved Lyndon Johnson, who was there in the car. John Connolly, the governor, was in the car. And somehow this whole thing happened, however it occurred, whether it was a conspiracy, one person. At this point, the point is that a psychic tried to warn the White House, had a vision. She was an astrologer and a psychic, and they didn't take her seriously. And that leads into this kind of thing. So the odd thing is, I've studied, except for the fact that I've also studied atomic energy and nuclear energy with astrology. This has to do with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear chain reaction of 1942, the fission reaction of how nuclear weapons and nuclear technology work. That's been my main astrology sort of work and research for 38 years about nuclear energy and atomic energy. People can read about that also in an article, a complimentary article on Aquarius News on our Great Bear website. But the thing with JFK is interesting, and I wasn't planning to bring it up, but using the psychic example, because this person, when John F. Kennedy died, the thing is, see, a lot of people now will look at 9/11, or they'll look at the pandemic, right? Or the Jonestown, something that's larger than life, these school shootings and terrible things that happen around the planet. But for anyone who's alive, like I was in 13, there are several things about that. And I've also studied all the planets and different things that happened. There were very remarkable, extraordinary alignments that happened on that day, regardless of who the perpetrator was or the perpetrators were and who covered it up and on and on. But the point is, this person was killed, and we had this vision, even though it was incorrect, of this guy and his beautiful wife and these two kids, right? Who represented this younger kind of thing than the older Eisenhower kind of thing and the older presidents. We suddenly had somebody, that was the day of the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, and then this person is murdered. And then immediately we go to a much older person in Lyndon Johnson, and suddenly we've got this war going on in Vietnam, and then we get all these student revolutions and all of these other things start happening, right? And look at where we are now. I mean, it's like 57 years later with what's just happened this year and recent years with all these tensions in our country and around the world. So every other country has their other, things that happen in France or Germany and so on. Dictators, World War II, World War I, emperors, czars, and so on. So like there was a Tsar, Alexander II, who was assassinated. I studied his chart in 1881. And that affected, he was actually a very good czar, of all czars and so on. And sometimes we get, some of these leaders and they're tyrants, and other people are good people and they lose their lives. But for this country, regardless of its politics and the things we discovered after, that is a haunting. That is a haunting psychologically, emotionally, that has never been resolved. And, look, that's why we still have all these conspiracy kind of things, or who did what. And whether it's the UFO, that, or the work that you're involved with, where all these things, how do we prove that is really a ghost? And one of the things I was going to say, and we could share more about this at the beginning, maybe this has happened on your show, the movie White Noise, okay, that has the guy, I always forget his name, he had been the first Batman, that actor. Okay, So in the beginning of White Noise, and then they made a White Noise #2. It's not the greatest movie, but it's interesting where they're trying to pick up about ghosts, on radio and on audio, right? They
Uh-huh.
start with a quotation from Thomas Edison right at the beginning of the show. And the quote, whether it's true or not, I was researching it again recently. I've studied Thomas Edison's birth chart a lot for various reasons because of the light bulb, the phonograph, moving
Right.
pictures, all of his inventions, amazing birth chart. And by the way, he and Alexander Graham Bell were born a month apart. And then Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. Actually, on my birthday, one of the more famous events, there were very few events on my birthday as a Pisces, but
Cool.
ones was that he invented the telescope in Boston in 1876 in March. So Alexander Graham Bell was born about a month after Thomas Edison. Edison was the Aquarius and Bell was the Pisces, which is very interesting. I associate them with Gates and Jobs. I'm not saying they were the same people reincarnationally, but the equivalent of those two guys, just like actually Elon, and I can't say I can prove this, but Elon Musk, who heads Tesla, is actually born on Nikola Tesla's birthday, the same day. So many 100+ years
Well,
later.
talk
What are
about
the odds?
reincarnation. My gosh.
Yeah. But at any rate, so all I can tell you is that at the beginning of White Noise, there's a quote from Thomas Edison. And I found it fascinating because what he was trying to say was, he said something like, I believe that someday we will be able to create or invent a device that's subtle enough or designed enough to be able to pick up souls or spirits from the afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have what? We have psychics. We have the work that you're doing. We
Mm-hmm.
have people who are using different techniques, and you know more about this, but I know certain types of photography now has been developed, these
Mm-hmm.
kind of things. And again, audio equipment. And it's all very fascinating. Where I come in on this is the electromagnetic spectrum. This is the key to everything to me, is that, see, we see from red to violet. And
Mm-hmm.
yet what happens is we know, because of astronomy and how the sun works, above violet is ultraviolet. That's a reality. We can't see it normally, but bees supposedly and birds, certain types of creatures and entities may have ultraviolet vision. In esoterics, we talk about etheric vision or astral projection and tuning in on other levels. Now, with cosmology and these physicists, they're talking about string theory, right? They're
Mm-hmm.
saying these other dimensions. Well, in metaphysics and my field, that's what we call the mental plane, the Buddhic plane, the planes in which masters and angels and higher beings, female, male, whatever gender we want to say, or some kind of hermaphroditic energy on another level, that there are these guides and shamans and teachers and that are a part of an invisible universe. Well,
Mm-hmm.
just as we have ultraviolet, gamma rays, X-rays, and cosmic rays, which are higher frequency waves above the color violet, below red, and I find this to be utterly fascinating, we have infrared, which is what we call heat.
Right.
So how many people think about the fact that when you see the color red, if you'd slow that down just a little bit, you'd feel heat? That's what heat is, which is a sensation or a warmth or whatever it is when out in the sun. And it's warm out and you feel that warmth. That heat is infrared radiation that's coming from the sun. It's not the color red. So we live with our sight in this small band, and then below red, infrared, you get radio waves and
Mm-hmm.
television waves and microwaves and things like that. So I have a microwave, a lot of people don't. When you're microwaving your food, it's at a frequency below infrared, below heat, like as if you turned on your oven, so you're heating up that with the way your oven is, the broiler or the heater or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, doing it for, so that's why the microwave, it'll only take a couple of minutes. That has to do with that wavelength. Somebody figured that out. They created microwave technology and so on. So what I think, okay, and I've already articulated this in some of my podcasts, but this is where I would go. This is my recommendation for what you're doing or other people who are interested in all this. The discovery is going to happen like this. It feels to me that those beings who have passed on, who are too attached to whatever it is, whether it's alcohol, drugs, or some kind of thing, a place, and they can't seem to leave it, they're more like below red. I mean, this is the metaphor. They're operating in like the infrared, radio, television wavelengths. In other words, their soul, their entity, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're free. Look, we know about electrical waves and our brain waves and sleeping and, being conscious or meditation. So it's all part of the fact that we're electromagnetic beings. And when we leave our physical bodies, then we still are an entity, but where are we, that entity? Okay, whereas I feel, shall we say, in general, the more advanced souls that are less attached to whatever it is, earthly desires or places or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
would tend to be moving from violet upward. I'm
Sure.
using that as a metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor, because we know that the sun has all of this radiation. So that's why the interesting thing is, the answer for some of this would be to contact astronomers, because astronomers have developed telescopes that can see, quote unquote, through infrared. Like
Mm-hmm.
I have astronomy magazine. It's the only magazine I get. And the magazines will come and you'll see these pictures and it'll say, okay, like for instance, they've now taken photographs at the center of our galaxy, which is 26,000 light years away. Supposedly there's a black hole there and it's surrounded by, I mean, we know that because of telescopes, but they
Mm-hmm.
can take pictures now. That's because of all the dust and all these other things. They can't use a regular optical telescope. So how do they see, right, the so-called black hole or all the stars around the center of the galaxy? They use infrared technology, or which is basically, or a radio telescope,
Mm-hmm.
which is right next to infrared. So I hear a lot, okay, we have this radio telescope from somewhere in the world, and here are these pictures of the black hole, or whatever it is that they're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Or here's the infrared. But they also have ultraviolet cameras, ultraviolet telescopes above violet for whatever. Maybe it's looking at the sun,
Right.
or
The
they
spectrum.
have X-ray technology. That's the area by which actually the whole Edison thing, or I think what you're all doing, and this is the
Mm-hmm.
first time I've ever said this, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I've never said this publicly. So if astronomers, the reason the astronomy thing should get together with what you're doing is that they're figuring out how to see in our solar system and other places through an invention or a series of inventions where they've made the telescopes not be optical. Because you have too much dust, there's too much interference. They've somehow figured out how to create a telescopic device. I've never had any of those devices. I love the stars and looking at them, in the heavens and all the stuff with my astrology work. But they have figured that out. So my understanding would be, if you could create a device, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two different kinds of devices, or you change the modulation. So whatever device you create that operates on the infrared radio wavelength, you'd contacting those ghosts, people, entities that are having a hard time moving upward into something that's on a higher level frequency. The higher level frequency people, you'd have to modulate and make that into like an ultraviolet, something beyond violet. And
That would be
even,
very interesting.
yeah, I'm just throwing this out. As a kid, I was on to some of this before I ever got into astrology. I had to do an experiment. I just remembered this recently for some science class. And where I lived in New York, we had a pretty large basement. And I came up with this idea of taking these Christmas lights, even though I wasn't even Christian, born Jewish. And I took this row of like lights, like little red light, green light, yellow, blue, and I attached them to a board. And I had my friends come over, and I would turn different lights on, and I would ask them, do you see these colors moving? Like, are they moving vertically? Are they stationary? When I turn on red, and in other words, just do some kind of experiment about color, about, people's views and so on. I remember doing that. And at that point, that's really the first time I started thinking about the rainbow, the seven colors, what's above violet, what's below red, and just sort of checking things out. So I never followed that up exactly, except for the study about the electromagnetic whole spectrum, including
Right.
color and what we see versus what we don't see, but which is out there because the sun has all this radiation above and below what our normal color or vision is.
Absolutely fascinating stuff.
So
Incredibly
I don't
fascinating.
throw out some ideas about where we're headed. That's a little harder to do. What does happen is that we're about to have, for instance, the new moon of Pisces. That's going to be on Saturday.
Mm-hmm.
So on my website, I have something called Global Hotspots, and I always do the new moon and the full moon and eclipses as they come up every 2 weeks. There's a new moon, and then a month later there's another new moon. But in between new moons, the two new moons, we always have a full moon, unless it's an eclipse, a partial eclipse, full moon eclipse, and so on. So each of the new moons and the full moons, um, they're going to give different energies at different times of the year. The main thing that we're dealing with, if we were going to say what is the biggest alignment this year or the most challenging
Mm-hmm.
one of those two planets, Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn in Aquarius is at what we call right angles, or making a square pattern of 90 degrees to the planet Uranus, the planet that proved that there's something beyond Saturn. Uranus discovered in 1781, right at the end of the American Revolution. And Uranus is now in Taurus, where it's been a few years. It will stay a few more years in that sign. And the whole thing with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and the dollar and gold and silver and commodities and all these things, part of that is because Jupiter and Saturn are now in air signs. And so air is more virtual, more technological, and people are intrigued by all that. But the other part is that Uranus is a planet of both intuition and revolution. So because it's in Taurus, aside from relating to earth and gardening and nature, is a sign of money. So in astrology, what's called the second house relates to the second sign of Taurus. And now we have this planet, for the first time in about 80 years, is moving through Taurus. And that has been happening for a couple of years. Now Saturn in Aquarius is making what we call a right angle of 90 degrees, using my hands. So two planets, if you think of geometry again, where you would do like a triangle, where there'd be one part of it be 90 degrees in an
Mm-hmm.
arc, and then you'd have the hypotenuse of the other angle in there. So a right triangle, however you want to call it. So Saturn in Aquarius has already made what we call the first square to Uranus in February. It's going to come back on June 14th to make another square through retrograde motion, because that is a reality, or an illusion reality. And even though we wouldn't blame Saturn or Uranus for going retrograde, that will be a retrograde alignment, and that'll be in June. And then we'll have it again around Christmas Eve. So if somebody is saying, of all the challenging things, what's going on, we've got Saturn, which is a planet of focus and hard work and responsibility when it's working well, in Aquarius, which is more group oriented. It's a sign of groups, teamwork, communities, the international scene. Aquarius is the third and final air sign. So we have both Jupiter and Saturn, but Saturn's the one that's in an antagonistic relationship with Uranus and Taurus. So we've got disruptions of markets. We've got questions about, should people invest in these things? Is it valid? Could it be too volatile? People worried about losing money, checking with brokers, checking with news. What should I do? What should I not do? And of course, so many people out of work, having lost,
Mm-hmm.
their incomes, lost their residences. So Uranus was already in Taurus last year and the year before, and so on. And it's not the only disruptor of markets and money and so on. But now, like last year, what was happening were a lot of planets in Capricorn, and Pluto has been there for many years. Capricorn is the last Earth sign, and our country is about to have what's called a Pluto return. Pluto has a cycle around the sun, or around the zodiac, of 247 years. And if you add 247 to 1776, you get 2023. Now, actually, what's going to happen next year, three times in 2022, and then a little bit in 2023, our country is dealing with Pluto. And in mythology, which is part of how astrology sort of understands these archetypes. Pluto is the god of the underworld, where we repress things, our phobias, our fears. It's also plutocracy, government by the wealthy, by people who have a lot of power. Power can lead to corruption. Again, when we see the world now, the upper 1% or whatever we want to call it, our last president was a billionaire. He always wanted to say, I have more billions than Forbes magazine is telling you. And it was always funny because I'm into George Lucas a lot and Star Wars and all that. And I've done a whole bunch of research astrologically about the Star Wars movies. There's stuff that's also in my podcast. But at any rate, when President Trump ascended to the presidency with all of this plutonic energy of being a plutocrat, of having billions of dollars, because we never really had anybody had that much money, even though he didn't have nearly as much as, Jeff Bezos or, Gates or whatever. But he was, I looked at a list and it was remarkable, about 300 something on the Forbes list of billionaires. Donald Trump was exactly tied with George Lucas for the same amount of their assets. It was like $3.4 billion, according to Forbes.
Wow.
And of course, Trump would always say, that's ridiculous. I have at least $10 billion. But the funny thing is then George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney, and then gained several billions of dollars more and all of these shares of Disney. Who knows what's happening? I know he didn't like the last Star Wars, and he didn't go to the opening of that ninth Star Wars. And that happened right before the whole pandemic thing happened. If we go back. But people can actually, I've studied UFOs in astrology and gotten into that, George Lucas and Star Wars and his chart and all the things in the Star Wars movies. I'm fascinated by all these things. And they were also in my magazine, and other people were writing about that. But I've had these pet subjects like JFK, nuclear energy, UFOs, Star Wars. So that's where I think a lot of people find it fascinating, because I'm not just doing a chart for a person. I can do that. I've done thousands of those, but I'm also simultaneously looking at the bigger picture: entertainment, metaphysics, climate change, coronavirus. What we're going through now with the pandemic, and this is the other thing that I find fascinating. Back in the 1300s, when there was the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, which was the worst, at least in the last 2,000 years, of what was happening. Even worse than what happened 102 years ago, with the Spanish flu. That was really bad for the world most recently, because the war was going on and we weren't learning lessons. We didn't have the medicine. People didn't know what it was. But if you go back to the 1300s with the Black Plague, bubonic plague, when they had even less medicine and less knowledge, we had the same Jupiter, Saturn in Aquarius. And we had this whole group of Aquarian things, because Aquarius is not just air and communication, it's the mind and thinking. And in those days, they would go from town to town. This came from China originally on boats. It was a different kind of plague with rats and fleas and all these things. And what happened to people, with their lymph nodes and other things. But what happened was they thought it was like the devil. They blamed Jewish people. They blamed witches. They blamed like places that were possessed or something. The devil was there. What did they do? This was the crazy ththing. They kept leaving those places. And there's no radio or television. It's not like there were newspapers in the 1300s. The Gutenberg, that didn't happen till like the 1400s. So the only thing that could have happened was the word of mouth from one town to another. Hey, we've got these illnesses. And when you see these pictures of people with, bodies and terrible things and their superstitions and so on. And the problem is that this went on for decades. So what happened in Florence then eventually moved into what we now call Germany or Switzerland. And then it moved into France. And then eventually it moved into England. Then it came back again, just like we're hearing about the variants. I mean, I've studied this a lot. History often repeats itself because astrology cycles are repeating. But they're repeating such a grand scale that if we don't know the history, then we don't know what to learn or how to correct ourselves.
So how long, based on that and looking at that, how long do you think we're going to be going through this pandemic thing? How long it's going to take us to get out of this?
Well, if we're as stupid as it appears that, look, Joe Biden is considered by many people, not to get into political, half the country or whatever it is think like he didn't really win the presidency, and half,
Right.
he's obviously the president, whatever. So he comes out, this is just an example of why we could be in trouble with the pandemic. Okay. He immediately declares a national emergency because of that cold and ice in Texas, which is generally a very Republican state, has a Republican governor, doesn't always kowtow to the federal government, wants to do its own thing. It's the whole history of Texas. It's always been like that. We do our own thing here,
My dog, I'm sorry. It scared me. Go ahead.
But at any rate, so Biden goes down there. He goes to Houston, which has a Democratic governor, a mayor, and is like the third most populous city. So it's an urban area that's not of the Republican sort of. I'm not. There are plenty of people in Houston who are Republican conservative. There are plenty of people who are more liberal. But the point is, it's an urban area, and so it's not exactly a representation of rural Texas, right? Or conservative Texas, or oil Texas, or whatever you want to call it. Remember, the show Dallas, who shot JR. I mean, like went on for all the years. I mean, that kind of thing. So what most people in the country would understand about, Texas has a lot to do with all these archetypes, the Alamo, the war with Mexico, the whole history, cattle ranches, and on and on. Of course, it's much more urbanized now. And I've driven through Texas, and I have connections with a lot of people. So I understand Texas. But at any rate, Joe Biden goes down. He goes down with his wife there. They're trying to sort of help people with emergencies, the cold wave, the ice, the electrical storm, and people are really hurting. And of course, it's affecting Mississippi and other places, but primarily Texas, and the whole country is focused. What the heck is going on there? Then what happens is the vaccines, this whole bill that's about to be passed and passes through the Senate last week. And immediately when the Senate passed it a few days ago, now it's back in the House, and I guess they're going to sign it into, it's $1.9 trillion. The governor of Texas and the governor of Mississippi both say, forget the mask, we're reopening everything. Businesses, because they want business to reopen. Well, here's the crazy thing about it. He might be totally right about people in Texas and business. But there are airports. There are people who are going to visit their relatives. If they're going to be people who are going to want to go to Texas just to visit their relatives. Hey, they don't have any masks. I'm in Oregon. We have a governor here who's more of a Democrat. They're going to keep the mask thing going. They're not going to. That governor here or in California, Gavin Newsom, he's not going to suddenly say, forget the mask. And even with Texas and Mississippi, and now Wyoming has joined, and Iowa has joined, and I think South Dakota, the more rural parts of the country, even though Houston is a big city, the governor has the power to say that. Now, local communities apparently could change that. And now the question that came up I saw on TV is there are business kinds of rulings about like how to go back to work that are national ordinances, about what is safe in a workplace. So a governor might say, forget the mask, like we're a mask-free state. The odds that in Oregon or California, after everything that's happened, particularly California with 40 billion people, Texas is the second most populous state after California. So, but you're going to have people going back and forth. Is there no airport in Houston? Of course there is. Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas. You got people going back and forth in Texas for business, for travel. So Californians wearing a mask, everything is important. You're going to go to the Dallas airport or visit somebody, take off your mask immediately, kumbaya, everything is fine. Or you're going to leave Texas, you might be incubating something, then you don't have your mask, you go to an airport where everybody is maskless, then you're going to go fly to Los Angeles, you're going to fly to Portland, you're going to fly to New York, you're going to fly to Flint, Michigan. What are they thinking? Are they out of their minds? Look, governors can get together and decide things that governors should decide in a coherent, reasonable way. But when individual governors or individual mayors or an individual president, it doesn't matter. If we're not doing things that are coherent, then we might as well go back 102 years ago or back to the 1300s. I'm not saying it will be as bad as that. So to answer that point, But when you hear about variants, the UK variant, it's more transmissible. It may not be as lethal, but it could mean that if you toss your mask away and you don't do 6 feet of distancing and you open up restaurants, we all want that. We want the kids to go back to school. I mean, common sense is we want to get back to some level of what could be normal. But if we do it in a way that is illogical, that's foolish, that doesn't relate to the also Saturn squaring Uranus or some of these other cycles, we're going to have some eclipses and other things which happen every year. There'll be a total solar eclipse in December, on December 4th. There'll be a total lunar eclipse in late May. Those will be the signs Gemini, Sagittarius for the full moon in late May. That's a powerful event because it's more powerful than a full moon if there's actually a total eclipse. It just makes everything more powerful. And then there'll be one in December. There's also going to be a lunar eclipse near Joe Biden's birthday, like within a day. And I've already reported about that in my last podcast. I'm not predicting anything, but it's never all that great when a celestial event like an eclipse happens to a person who's 78 years old, who's president of the United States and dealing with the stresses of their own party and the opposite party, international relations, having your finger on the nuclear button, trying to cure a pandemic. So, well, we're all like, look, I know there are people who are really angry and don't think that guy should be in there or whatever it is, or same thing with Kamala Harris. But most people, even if they're conservative or against a person like Joe Biden or whoever's in office from the other party, are not going to wish that person, illness or negativity or something bad to happen to them. Well, some people apparently do. We're so divided in the country. I don't think we're not to the point of the secession thing, but we are. This is the other really challenging thing. The planet Neptune, which has a lesser cycle than 247 years with Pluto. We're already dealing with 2022, 2023 for our country because we have what's called this Pluto return. This year, the planet Neptune in the sign Pisces is going opposite where it was when the country started July 4th, 1776. In the chart for the US that I work with, Neptune's in Virgo, that sign. And now we have, if I can put my hands, we have an opposition, 180 degrees. So Neptune is going to move. If it was a person's chart, Charlotte, Neptune would be at the bottom of the chart of that individual, but by transit or in the sky. But the natal position of that planet is up above, and that's a polarity of 180 degrees. And that's like as if Neptune is making a full moon, and either a schizzy, divisive polarization or an illumination. So that's the issue for the United States this year. Are we going to be inspired? Neptune is a planet of inspiration and love and compassion and understanding and psychic sensitivity and creative artistry and imagination, and like your field of these investigations into things like the paranormal. But the negative side of Neptune is chaos, confusion, fake news, sending things out that are inaccurate, and just feeling a lot of chaos going on. And so that can affect us with the markets, with money, with whether or not people comply with these orders in some reasonable way with the pandemic, so we don't have another surge or series of surges. The problem I have in astrology so much is I'm aware of these challenges, so I have to prevent myself from becoming Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Because, again, one of the things that makes news is, and this has always happened, somebody predicts the big one, the San Andreas Fault. We're going to have, like, what I find fascinating is, do you know how few of these discussions have been happening over the last year with the pandemic? When you have fires, floods in California, the thing that happened in Paradise with the electrical grid with PG&E, and then the pandemic. We know we have the Ring of Fire in the Pacific, right? The whole thing with tectonic plates. But before the pandemic and before so much of the fires, we would always think of again, a volcano up here in the Northwest as well. We're due, because it was a couple hundred years ago, the last big tsunami, or we had Mount St. Helens, not far away. I wasn't even here then, but that was 1980. And that's when you talk about climate change and stuff, where people say, well, I don't believe in it, or, the aerosol, sprays or whatever it is, that's not causing it. I have no idea exactly how much human beings are doing it, but I do know this. If a Krakatoa exploded again, it wouldn't matter how many aerosol sprays we were using. Those are the kind of things that will create all kinds of climate change, because you're spewing out all this ash and terrible stuff, you're blocking the sun and so on. And of course, the sun has an influence on us all the time. Solar wind, worries about solar flares, these eruptions from the sun, which I'm also just did a podcast about, having to
Hmm.
do with what's called the Carrington event from 1859, where we had an eruption called the coronal mass ejection from the sun, the solar plasma hitting the Earth. And in those days, we only had the telegraph. But now we have the whole grid. We have radio, television, 24/7, everything, bank accounts, money, virtual money. And plus, there are other things to be alarmed about. So this thing of Neptune, with our country in particular going opposite next year, there is a feeling at times, I don't like to be Chicken Little and about the pandemic that you asked about,
Right.
but if if the governor of Texas and Mississippi, if they had said something like, we want to have a meeting with governors to determine what is the optimum and the most realistic time we can get rid of our masks, and we can do this, and we want to coordinate with the CDC and so on. That sounds normal to me.
Hmm.
Now, I don't know, there are people listening who might say, that guy is a kook, because, I'm on other shows and they'll think I'm too liberal or whatever. But I think that I'm trying to come from an astrological place, and astrology, because we have mathematics and we know when the cycles are happening,
Hmm.
is very mathematical. In other words, this whole thing about fake news, other things, or this is bogus, or we don't believe this person was elected or not. When I grew up, the almanac, I was not a big reader, but my dad was doing like the New York Times crossword puzzle. He was a doctor, he was well read, well educated, but he would get the World Almanac, the actual original one that had all the statistics. And I love sports. That's how I got into all this. I love baseball. I grew up in New York City. A lot of people hate that because our team, the New York Yankees, won all these World Series. But we had the Brooklyn Dodgers there, and the New York Giants before they moved to San Francisco and Los Angeles. But New York City has lots of baseball and football because it's so big, and college and whatever. And I grew up with sports. So I read the World Almanac, literally almanacs of statistics of baseball, of home runs and RBIs, and who won college football championship, and how many home runs were hit, and all these statistics, who won what World Series, as well, tornadoes, floods. They'd have sections on history and geography. So that got my mind into reality. And then I love math, and particularly algebra and geometry. So when I hear things about alternate facts, or, this didn't happen, 2 + 2 is still 4. There's, even if you were to ask somebody like whether somebody's president or they're not, if you ask them the question, if you have 2 apples and I give you another 2, how many apples do you have? Is
Right.
somebody going to say 5? It's like, really? Okay, great. You're a lunatic. You know what I mean? Like, you're not making any sense. It's 4. It's always been 4. It's still 4. So, it may sound kind of silly or whatever, but again, with numbers, the thing is, for instance, my hero was Mickey Mantle growing up.
Hmm.
I know how many home runs he hit. I got to see a World Series game where he hit one. I know that he has 536 home runs in his lifetime. It's not 535. It's not 538. It's not 537. You know, what people, men and women, girls and boys, we now wear numbers on uniforms all over the place. People don't even realize that never used to happen. People played
Yeah.
sports without having their names and numbers, and actually, the interesting thing for folks out there, I mean, this is a little bit on the sports, but it's also on numerology. Back in New York in the 1920s, after Babe Ruth was sold from the Boston Red Sox to the Yankees, which the Red Sox hated because they never got into a World Series until recently, Babe Ruth hit all these home runs, and by 1927, he was such a household name around the country. The New York Yankees decided to do something that nobody else was doing. Let's put numbers on uniforms. So what they did was Babe Ruth became number 3. Now, if you look at all these pictures of Babe Ruth and baseball cards, which have their own value, you'll
Hmm.
see Babe Ruth and on the back of his uniform, they didn't have his name because they knew who he was. They put the number 3. Then Lou Gehrig, who died of, what we now call Lou Gehrig's disease, he had number 4. And when Joe DiMaggio came from San Francisco, was signed by the Yankees in the 30s, he was given number 5. Now, they didn't put the name DiMaggio on there, but here's the thing. The number 3 was given to Ruth, not because he said, I want to be 3. He was the 3rd in the order coming up in the batting order. There was another guy who was number 1, another guy was 2, and he was number 3. So the managers or the owners of the Yankees said, let's make Ruth 3. We're putting numbers on. Well, what about Gehrig? Well, let's give him 4. He's the cleanup guy. He's number 4. I'm only bringing this up because like now, numbers, which are the basis of astrology, numerology, and all the things in this field, have a qualitative value. So for instance, you can go back to Leonardo da Vinci. There's a famous drawing of the pentagram. It's the human being. Like we are basically a star, each one of us. Somehow, on an invisible level, the human being is a torso with 2 arms and 2 legs. So the way that da Vinci drew that picture was like as if it's in a 5-pointed star. And so that's a pentagram or a pentagon. And then this goes back to Pythagorean mathematics, where the number 1 is not just a quantity of 1 apple, it's what they would call the monad. And the different numbers had different qualities. This is where we get the basis of numerology, but also astrology, statistics, but also of just people loving numbers. Our birthdays, celebrating birthdays and the days of, the number of the day, and when people do lotteries and stuff, oh, I use 7 because so-and-so was, my mother or dad was born on the 7th, or whatever your favorite numbers are, or some kind of vibration. It goes back to what I was saying with the electromagnetic spectrum, frequencies, vibrations, things in your field. I do believe here's the problem of trying to communicate with somebody from the other side. This is the big thing. They don't have a physical body. They don't have a voice, So this is the thing. We tend to assume, even with a ghost, I mean, this is just what I'm saying, quite practically, whether the person, if they've passed on, so they either their body is buried in the ground in some way, or they're cremated, right? Or whatever. Okay. So they don't have a voice as we would understand a voice. So we tend to think of supernatural things like, well, like in religion for Christianity, the Messiah coming back, the Bodhisattva or whatever. And we tend to think of these people, because of religion and philosophy, that they are gods and so on, as if, and people often say, well, I heard the voice of the Virgin Mary, right? Spoke to me. Or the voice of Jesus, or whatever their perception of whatever that would be, or the Buddha, or whoever in whatever religion, or some teacher, or whatever. But what we're really talking about is telepathy. And we're talking about things of what I call clairvoyance and clairaudience, which is why we have television and radio. And see, I've studied all of this, but not necessarily, I'm not an engineer, and I'm not trained as a scientist, right? But as a philosopher, for instance, what I tuned into, and I've studied the discoverers of these things like Marconi and when did radio come into being, to understand more of radio waves and things like that, or the nuclear atomic things. And I've studied when an event happened, like a Hiroshima or the first nuclear fusion reaction. And I'm using astrology as a tool to understand that. So in a way, that's like if you or people in your field were to take, it's like a Geiger counter, right, for radioactivity. You might be using a certain device through photography, and I may not be up on all of it, or some kind of whatever it is to monitor, okay, there's heat here, there are some presences that are going on, right, in these buildings, in this land. I mean, I remember Rob Lowe and his son did something on, I don't know if it's still on anymore. And
I like that show, actually.
Well, because Rob Lowe, and he's, it's great for him because he's on another show, and he's a great movie star and this and that. So he can bring in his son and have a reality show and put it on wherever, Discovery or E or who knows what it was on. But the point is, this is all helpful, just like, History Channel, Ancient Aliens, what you're doing is that, look, places are haunted. There's no doubt about it. Again, all of America, one of the things, I'm living in the suburbs of Eugene, we're in California. Native American tribes, all over before the wave of whoever came here from all parts of the world, all these different, Apache, the Iroquois, the Sioux, the Cherokee, and so on, and their religions and burying their, families and living there, and supposedly our continent is connected to Atlantis and all that, so you can go back even before Native Americans. So I often feel like these ancestors, these spirits, or whatever they are, right, as well as people who've passed on. And my question, because my main loved one has passed on, as well as, of course, parents and grandparents and relatives, my big question again is always, which I'm sure is for you, I mean, or any of people who are into this, where are they? I mean, where are they? Not so much where are they physically, but where are they mentally and spiritually, and souls and spirits, whatever vibrational kind of thing.
Right.
For when we have these storms and ice storms, how many people are thinking of their relatives who passed away? Because obviously they don't have a body. They don't have to worry about ice or storm or fire or flood,
No.
right? But we
No.
do, and we have the memories, and we may have in our homes or our apartments or where we're living, whether it's a tent or an RV, whether we have a home or are homeless, we have our memories, but we also have our mementos, and we also have, whether it's good luck charms or things that we own or that we have because the other person passed on. And then we get into the things of charms and like vibrations, that we still feel this kinship, whether it's superstition or not. But the point is, we either believe, either there is a thing of like, oh, there is no afterlife, there's no spirit, there's no soul, there's none of that, or there is. I mean, I don't think there is any in between really there. I mean, we either live in a universe where there's all these levels of consciousness and so on, whether we have a physical body or not. But
Right.
the question, it's like, again, I think that what I'm trying to do, and I can be wrong about this, but what strikes me is, and I've studied this and I have a lot of books on this, of it's telepathy that we're trying to do. So maybe the way we have to create a device is something that allows the mind, right, the consciousness of whatever it is, to then be transcribed. I think that's what Edison was after. In other words, it's kind of like what we have now, which actually one of my teachers where I worked, her name was Alice A. Bailey, and she was a channel, or what you ever want to call it, medium, for this teacher known as the Tibetan Master DK. So there's all these books. Now, before that, this same entity, the same master, related to another person for 30 years called Helena Blavatsky. This has to do with the founding of what's called the Theosophical Society. This is not that far from what you do. Because back in the 1800s, when Neptune came into being in 1846 and was discovered, this is the heyday when you think of photography. And I'm going to mispronounce this, the daguerreotypes, in other words, the beginning of photography. When somebody sat there, they had to sit there for a long time because the photographic plates and all this stuff wasn't just like a Polaroid. It wasn't an instantaneous thing with our iPhones or mobile phones. So, and then seances, this happened with Abraham Lincoln and his wife because they lost one of their kids early before even going there, and then they lost somebody else in the White House. And she was doing seances, and so on. And so Abraham Lincoln, he was going, they're having a special now on one of the TV stations that he isn't the person we thought he was. I mean, I knew that too, but I mean, there was always things about his life, his personal life, his family life, and his marriage, and his kids, and everything, and depression. So all these things were happening, and then trances and mediumistic things, and all of this has been happening a lot, but it particularly started happening a lot in the 1800s. And I just watched the Luminaries. I don't know if you've seen that, but that's based on a novel, and it's a show, and it goes back to the 1800s, the mid 1800s, where they discovered gold in New Zealand. And the characters in that movie are working with astrology and also things of wheels of fortune and all these things that are part of, like, from the 1800s, of the more spiritualistic kind of things that were developed at that point. So I guess my final point here is communication with entities, or it would be like finding their mind and having a device that could transcribe it. Just like recently, I have a recording thing when I do consultations now. This is very interesting that I'm even saying this. It's called Tape-A-Call, and it's the best system I've had ever to record a conversation and
Mm-hmm.
send it to people when I do their readings now. And I can send it to their text mobile phone. This is the first time I've been able to do that. Normally, I used to do it in a completely different way, attach it to an email, or, I mean, in the old days, I did it on CDs, or I did it on a cassette tape and did a recording and sent it. Or I just had a conversation, we didn't record it. Well, I just looked at the Tape-A-Call thing where it's in the recording, and below, even though I haven't looked into this, it says transcribe recordings. Like, in other words, maybe for a more elaborate price, there will be some kind of technique that I guess they've developed. I don't know how accurate it be, that whatever I'm saying will become written. And I had actually somebody asked me that recently. They said, "Can you record? Do you transcribe your recordings?" And I thought, look, can't you just be happy that I'm doing a recording? Like you do not want to listen to, that's an audio recording.
Right.
And so what they wanted, because I guess they're more verbal or more literary, they preferred that. Now she actually hasn't written me back, because maybe that's what she wants, and maybe she'll change her mind and say, look, I still want the reading. But it is interesting. What I'm trying to say is that there's got to be a device, and I'm sure it will be developed, if you can figure out what the frequency is or make the right communication. What we're talking about is a kind of telepathic rapport to get a transcription of what is going on in the mind of whoever it is you're trying to contact on the other side.
That would be fascinating.
Right. Because they're not, or you can create something that isn't a transcription that's literary, but can actually change their thoughts into words. Then that would be even more subtle. Or, I mean, just like we have what we started with today. Hey, you're upside down. Can you turn your iPad? We need to get you straight. Like when I'm looking at the screen now,
Yeah.
I'm upright, you're upside down, and your name and my name are upside down, although my picture is right side up. The other
That's
thing that's
crazy.
really fascinating about all this is the weird thing. I mean, this is true. This is not fake news. When we're born, because of the way our eyes work,
Uh-huh.
we have to learn to reverse all the images. So initially, when we see, like, again, I have two daughters, I remember their births and seeing them for the first time. If a baby could sort of understand what it was looking at, it would see you upside down. They have to learn, your eyes have to learn this thing. You can study this. I mean, I don't know. This is interesting because of this upside down thing that we started with. So somehow, every one of us, when we come into the world, the mechanism of our brains and our eyes, we have to do this mechanism so that all the things that initially seem upside down, we make right side up. Now, if what I'm saying is correct, which I'm pretty sure almost 100%, because I remember taking biology and learning about this, if all of us have the capacity to do that, right, then what does that mean about what is the world actually? And when you look in a mirror, right, at yourself, you
Uh-huh.
don't see who you really are. You're seeing the reverse of who you are. So for instance, like right now, when I see myself in this kind of thing, when I part my hair, I'm parting it this way. And when I see myself differently than when other people see me. So when people see you, they see kind of the reverse of what you think you look like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Because we can only see ourselves in the mirror. I think that what I'm saying, it may not be straight astrology, but it is the key to what you're talking about or what you're
Uh-huh.
trying to do. What we have to do as human beings to communicate with deceased individuals in whatever way as spirits is kind of do all this mirror reflection. Let me give you one other example that your audience and you will find interesting. And if you want to have me on again, I mean, we could talk about more of the stuff.
Oh,
Well, no,
absolutely. I was going to say that towards the end of this. I want to get you back on
well,
because
I
this,
wasn't.
this is
And by the way,
great.
this was not. I don't have a script here. I'm going with the flow here. you know, and knowing what your subject matter is in general and improvising. But let me tell you this remarkable thing in the literature. This is like the be all and end all of all bizarre things. Okay, so I believe that we have an angelic evolution, what is often called devas in different cultures. So I believe each one of us has a guardian angel, and I've had my own out of the body experience when I was 22 of my own angelic, whatever it is. I believe each one of us has this. Look, in religions of different kinds, people talk about my guardian angel or my whatever, an angel on my shoulder or whatever it is. We use terms, we throw around angel, devil, positive, negative, whatever, good and evil.
Right.
Now, in the literature, there's actually a particular thing in all these books. This is the place, it's called Lucis Trust and Publishing Company. I learned meditation there and other things before I traveled to Findhorn in Scotland, which was a wonderful experience at this community for a number of years, which was no gurus, there were founders there, but, just an open educational kind of thing. It was one of the best places ever. But in the literature, there's a place, well, let me put it this way. In Scotland, there's a botanical gardens in Edinburgh. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been at. Edinburgh is not too far from where Findhorn is further north. It's about 5 hours further south. Edinburgh is an amazing city with a great history. They got a beautiful park. It's just gorgeous. At least it was back in the 70s. I mean, immaculate. Plus, in the park were these botanical gardens. One of the founders of the community of Findhorn, his nickname was Rock, R-O-C. He had a long name, whatever. He had the capacity to see devas or spirits, nature spirits. And that goes back, when you hear of fairies and gnomes and dwarves and all these different things, you go back mostly to Ireland, to Scotland, to England. I'm not saying it's not in other parts of the world too, with little people, brownies. There are different kind of things of creatures or auras and nature spirits and great lights and beings and radiatory things. So at any rate, in literature, there was a saying, again, think of devas as angels. And this teacher who's describing it through this woman, Alice Bailey, for 30 years in these books, he says, or she says, that devas are angels, get this is the weird thing, see sound and hear color, and humans reverse it. So devas see sound, okay, hear color, and humans reverse it. Now back to this thing of the mirror reflection. If there is an angelic species, which I believe it is, if that's on a higher level, which I believe it is, when you say my soul, my angel, my guardian angel, they're operating on a different frequency. I don't believe human beings can live without having a soul or a soul connection to what we would call the angelic kingdom. I think this is why in meditation, these people who have this profound thing and feel enlightened, is that they've made this kind of mirror reflection thing, that where the angelic or the Davic world is all at is they are seeing sound. Okay, they're hearing color, which is inconceivable to us. We see color and hear sound. That principle that's operating on the higher level, when we come in and we become part of an incarnation, a materialistic body, just like our eyes have to reverse everything, we have all these wavelengths, for sleep and awakening, delta, alpha, whatever it is. We're electrical magnetic beings, aside from having physical bodies. So we are now reversing, in order to deal with the physical world of all this tangible stuff, to be effective human beings, we have to reverse what the spirits or the angels have. How amazing would it be, right? To hear color, whatever that means, and to see sound. So I just contemplating it is like amazing, because it's not something that, we do have people who have phenomenal senses, who have some of these. And remember Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That whole thing with the music and the tones and the little kid and the UFOs, that was, I think, the best. There may be other ones. I think that was back in 1977 in the fall, the same year that Star Wars came out in the spring. So we got Spielberg and we got Lucas, and they're another two of these magicians, like Tesla, and Edison, and whoever they are. We get different people, men and women in different fields, often sort of coming in, tandems, these sort of duos, coming out like Edison and Bell and so on, like creating these inventions and different things. So at any rate, that movie I saw over and over again. And I had come back from Findhorn, and a lot of my friends were coming into New York, where I was staying at my parents' house temporarily. And every time somebody came in, they stayed with me. And I said, okay, we're going to Manhattan the next day. And I said, why? I said, well, that's because Close Encounters is playing. And it was only playing in Manhattan. And I took all these people. So I saw that movie over and over again. And that whole thing,
That's
the tones, that also created my business, The Great Bear, because toward the end of the movie, when Richard Dreyfuss is part of this thing and they're at the Devil's Tower
mm-hmm.
with the gal, they look up and the UFOs make the symbol of the 7 stars of the Great Bear for a split second, and he laughs. And then they go and they have the whole thing, and then he goes on the spaceship.
Mm-hmm.
Now I've just ruined that for anybody who never saw Close Encounters.
You're absolutely right though, because when you look at even Star Trek, what Gene Roddenberry came
Right,
up with
right.
for that, all the computer scans and everything that he had, a lot of that's been incorporated now. Cell phones, flip phones, a lot of that's been
Yeah,
incorporated.
yeah, the deck where they have that whole thing where they have like this visual thing where they're
Mm-hmm.
living in an alternate, environment, like an
Mm-hmm.
alternate reality.
Yep.
And again, that was amazing. That started the whole thing. Of course, Leonard Nimoy has passed on.
Right.
But now William Shatner is doing things the unexplained. I mean, and he's in his 80s. He was,
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing how long he has been around. And I watched the first year. I was a teenager, and then what happened was, I mean, we couldn't get enough of that. Of course,
Right.
we had things like Lost in Space came, which is more campy and other things. But when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, I mean, we watched. I mean, who would remember that Steve McQueen starred in The Blob? Steve McQueen, before he became with the race car, The Great Escape, and all these other things, became a big star. He was on TV, wanted dead or alive.
Oh,
He was.
William Shatner did Twilight Zone.
Oh well, and the Twilight Zone connects up a lot to this planet called Chiron, discovered in 1977, because literally Rod Serling was born when this little planet we only discovered in 1977, and that planet has a 50-year cycle. And I've
Mm-hmm.
studied Chiron a lot. President Kennedy died when Chiron was not moving or stationary, and when planets are not moving or stationary, before they go retrograde or direct, they stop from the Earth's point of view, for a period of a day or a couple of days. And Chiron has a lot to do with healing and woundedness, and it's shamanic and all these wonderful things in healing. But it also rules the twilight zone, higher dimensions of consciousness. And so it turns out Rod Serling himself, who invented the Twilight Zone, and I've studied his chart and I've written about it and talked about it in my podcast, he was born when Chiron came back in its cycle for the United States, and he
Mm-hmm.
lived exactly a Chiron cycle. And when Chiron came back, he died. Now, to give you an example, Mark Twain was born when Halley's Comet came in 1835. And at one point later in his life, after writing all this stuff, somebody asked him, "Hey, you came in with Halley's Comet," and he said, "And I think I will go out." And when Halley's Comet came back, it's a periodic comet, not one that just comes in and is gone. It has a 76-year cycle, and he lived to be that age. And Halley's Comet came back, and he died. Now, how do you explain that? He was joking around about it, but that means as above, so below. There are these mysterious things, you know, which is what you're talking about. So, and I've had so many, I just did a podcast about 47 years as a psychic astrologer, and I'm not doing it as the fact that I'm a psychic, right?
Mm-hmm.
I define the word psychic from the dictionary. It's basically having an agile mind and having a sensitive mind. And all of us are psychic to one level or another. We don't have to be an astrologer or a guru or whatever it is. All of us have, I often like to think we have our 5 senses. And then what was the movie, with the kid by Shyamalan, I See Dead People?
Right.
Whatever that was called, the something sense. I forget what
The
it's called.
Sixth Sense. Yeah.
Yeah, the sixth sense. So just like the Twilight Zone, which is there is a dimension in time and space, and we call it the Twilight Zone, was kind of like beyond the 3 dimensions, there is this other dimension, 4th or 5th dimension, what do we want to call it? And then Einstein creates the whole thing of the space-time continuum, that everything is not what Newton or other people thought. It's different. Space is curved. We see starlight. He proves this whole thing that the light gets bent, by the way that space and time are curved. I mean, we're still in this kind of whole changed universe of how everything is. So it's not surprising that we now be at a point where I'm not sure how long you've been doing what you're doing. I guess it's quite a number of years now.
About 15.
Yeah, and you must have been interested in it growing up, or at a certain point you decided you want to do this professionally, right?
I grew up in a haunted house.
Well, that explains that. The house I grew up in was built in 1924. It was a very large house. We moved when I was 5, and it scared me because it was considered a mansion. It was a very big house in one of the boroughs in Queens, New York, and it was frightening because there was the basement, and it had an old oil burning furnace, which made a lot of noise. And as a little kid, we moved in there when I was 5, and there were other things. There were actually bars on the window because the people who had built in 1924, because it was a kind of a big building, it didn't have a lot of acreage, but the house was very big. And it's kind of like an English Tudor neighborhood. And they had these bars on the windows that there was what's called the Holmes device. We had a little alarm closet. So before leaving, you'd set this alarm. And when you came in, you had to do it in order to prevent theft, prevent burglaries. But when the house was created, they put actually, like on my sister's room across the hall, there were bars on the window. If you accidentally, it felt like growing up in a prison in many ways, because you couldn't just look out the window like a beautiful window. There literally were, when I say bars, they were electronic kind of bars. And this is interesting. I never thought of it till now. They must have had a magnetic or some kind of electronic thing, because if you touched one of them and moved it out, you could cause the alarm to go on, and then the people from this company would come racing to the house thinking somebody had broken in through the window. It was a very strange place to be born. So I never thought of it as haunted, but it was really weird. So just not to turn the whole thing back on you, but what was it like? I mean, have you reinvestigated where you lived and gone back
Actually,
there?
I'm still here.
Oh, you're still in the
I'm
house.
still here. My thing is a lot of kids, the majority of kids are born with abilities.
Okay.
And, as we get older, we kind of put them on the back burner. And the
Right.
problem I had was that I would see things
Okay.
and nobody else did.
Wow.
And it was always, well, you're having nightmares, you're having this. And it's always, no, I see
We'll have
things in this house.
we'll have to take a look at, your chart someday, or some of your plants, privately. But what I would say
Yeah.
is, that's interesting you bring that up. And in the Psychic Astrologer podcast I didn't bring up all of it, but I've had these intuitive things, what I call kind of my own still small voice in my mind. And it's particularly happened in sports, where that's what led me to go to a World Series where I didn't have a ticket, and I got into this game and saw my hero hit his most famous home run. And it's an amazing story, and it changed my life because of the magic involved. And then there was another time that I broke my collarbone, and I couldn't get out of bed, and I thought I had polio. And I learned after I broke my collarbone that day, which was only a week after this other World Series thing, that something was trying to tell me not to get out of bed that day, that an accident was going to happen. But the other thing was, as a little kid, when there was a thunderstorm, and how you see these movies, again, with the kid with the sixth sense, I see dead people,
Right.
that in so many movies and in real life, we have children who will say, oh, I was playing with Mary. And the mother will say, oh, well, who's Mary? And the little girl in the movie or whatever will say, oh, well, she's, she comes and visits me, and, we play around with our dolls and whatever it is. And then, the mother thinks it's all fantasy until, I was just actually watching a remake of the Amityville Horror, and that was exactly what was happening. This is not the old one, with James Brolin. This is like a new one. And it was on the other night. I just flipped through it because, again, that's on Long Island, and I grew up in New York, and I just was watching it for a few minutes. And then I turned the whole thing off because I didn't want to go to sleep having these bad dreams. But talking about haunting and, you in that house, when there was a thunderstorm, and this relates back to the principles of Jupiter, I'll mention this because this could be fascinating for you and the audience. According to one of my great teachers, and he was a seer, he's the person who created the Waldorf school system around the world. His name was Rudolf Steiner. And he wrote a lot of spiritual books. In fact, the first book I ever read before astrology and other things, was a book by this fellow, Rudolf Steiner, called Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and How to Attain It. And he was literally one of, like I use the word seer, like a Nostradamus, but this was a broad thing, all of human history, the earth, the cosmos, sort of spiritual beings, And he said something that as a child I experienced. And that's why I guess I found him. As a little kid, when there was a thunderstorm, I heard what I thought, at least what I felt, was like the voice of Jupiter, like the thunder god.
Uh-huh.
And I would put my head when I was so scared of the thunder, because as a little kid, if it's not like my dad said, oh, somebody might say it's only a thunderstorm, it's only a rain, whatever. So again, being in a house where you have these bars there, you're a little kid, you hear a thunderstorm. New York City had a lot of thunderstorms, in the summer when the humidity and everything. And I would put, as a 5, 6, 7-year-old, particularly in the beginning, I would put my head under the pillow because I would hear like the voice of what I thought was like a god in the thunder. Well, guess what? When I started reading Rudolf Steiner, and he talked about not now, but that human beings in the past, as because basically the alternate way of looking at what's happened on Earth is not so much that you just have evolution. We've evolved from monkeys and apes. Okay, yes, you have physical bodies that have evolved from over millions of years. But according, just like with the ancient aliens and higher ways of looking at it, we're souls and spirits who then inhabit these bodies as they've been evolving. So you can actually have the sort of creation myth and the evolution don't have to be completely incompatible if you think about it in the right way. That you have nature on Earth evolving bodies and so on, Neanderthals, different species, Homo sapiens, and so on. You have different things. Of course, we've distorted. Oh, people in the religious communities. I'm not, and my ancestor is not a monkey. My ancestor is not an ape, or whatever they will say, because you study Darwin and they will say, okay, here's how the evolution happened.
Right.
However, then you have the people who say, oh, time, human beings started in 4004 BC. This is one of these kind of things where suddenly there's Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, nothing happened before that. There was no Atlantis, there was no grand, we're living on other planets, or we're, part of an alien species or anything. Their whole thing is, this religious thing, whether it, be Christian, Islamic, or Hebrew, or wherever it comes from. And there are these two people, and it was a beautiful beginning, and that's the beginning of, of time as we know it. And then everything starts from this pristine two human beings, who are just like perfectly created by some divine entity. Whereas when you study the spiritual literature, it's more like suddenly the way they talk about it, there's a black race, a red race, a yellow race, a white race, or there's 5 different races, and they all sort of suddenly start happening. You got Americas, you got Africa, you got Europe, you got Southern Hemisphere, at least this is part of the thing, so that we're all part of a common heritage, and we're all over thousands, if not tens of thousands, or even millions of years. When you study Edgar Cayce, he's not talking about what the only way a lot of the archaeologists and anthropologists, they'll go back, a couple thousand years, when they thought the pyramid was, and then Cayce would say, no, it's not 2,500, it's like 10,000. When the big pyramid was created, and we have all the dates wrong. You got all these people doing this research. But Edgar Cayce goes back, the original Atlantis was like 1 million years ago, and then there was a destruction. Then at 100,000 years ago, there was another one. And then the one that we think happened, even though many people deny it, is then 10,000 during the Great Flood or some other thing. But that's as far back because we don't have the records and we can't remember.
Right.
So at any rate, throwing around these ideas, I just think that as in Hamlet, there's whoever says, either Hamlet to Horatio or Horatio to Hamlet, says there are more things that are dreamt of in your philosophy that are real. In other words, the dream world, the world that is on the invisible level. And Einstein, the same thing, where he would say something, the universe is far more mysterious than you can even imagine. So what you're doing, and the thing of the hauntings, but Rudolf Steiner actually wound up saying that at an earlier time in humanity, when we were more sensitive to things that were spiritual,
Mm-hmm.
that during a storm, and this is why, like, it was like when I read this, it's like, oh my God, that's what happened when I heard the thunderstorm. He said that human beings had a higher sensitivity in the earlier days, like Atlantean days, Lemurian days, all these other, older time periods, when we were more connected to our soul world. You know what I mean? We were just beginning
Right.
to sort of get into human bodies. And so during a thunderstorm or hurricane or whatever it would be, we would, like in the clouds, we would actually hear the voices of the entities like that. What he's basically saying is when there is a thunderstorm, we don't see it now because we don't have that vision. That's actually a battle of like invisible beings in the clouds
Mm-hmm.
and in the rainstorm or the snowstorm or the ice storm, whatever it is. And if you could see it as he would see it, you'd see this phenomenal jousting and battling of entities and spirits and forms that are part of what we would call the substance, or the invisible Davic substance. Because of our way of looking at science now, the weather forecast will say thunderstorms over Kansas City, like, watch out for this. Here's the track. Everything is like, like, well, if you're on this area, brace yourself, whatever, for a hurricane, whatever. And where everything is all tangible and everything is, again, scientific and technological. And we've lost touch with the kind of invisible. The other thing that he said, which is phenomenal, and this would relate to where you live and so many people who will listen to your show, he actually said that when you look at the Parthenon, right, when you look at the cathedrals, and this is often on some of these like ancient alien things, and they've gotten into it, temples in India, Stonehenge, whatever, they created these things so that the acoustics and the meditations and the rituals that would happen there. So when they created, like in Rome, the temple of Jupiter, or wherever it was, in Athens and so on, to a particular entity, the people who designed it, the architects, the artists, and so on, were given sort of intellectually and intuitively the plans. They didn't just say, oh, this would be nice to put these columns here and make this into that arc. It was like downloaded, so to speak, into their higher minds. And then as a group, almost, they do this thing so that the music, the rituals, the way the thing was constructed, you would be able to sort of have a communication with that god or goddess in that place. And the same thing with the cathedrals. Well, look at the thing about what you're saying with the hauntings.
Mm-hmm.
I remember with my late partner, her daughter was thinking of finding a place to live. This is many, many years ago. And it was funny that I just remembered this. We were invited, it was a Sunday, and daughter said, Mom, can you come up? We're thinking of this house. And we drove up, and it was about an hour up here in Oregon. And we got to the house. We looked at one another because we were very simpatico with each other psychically. And she and I both turned to each other and we said, somebody had to have been murdered in this house. That was the first thing we got. Like, we basically talked the daughter out and said, well, first of all, there were many reasons why this practically, money and what they were asking for the price is like, there's no way on earth we would want her living there with her husband. And at that point, the couple of kids, there were 3 kids, or there was only 2 kids at that point, or even one of the 3 that eventually were born. It was like, we don't want the grandson living here. We don't want you living here. We don't want the son-in-law living here. Somebody would have had to have died here. We went inside and we were thinking, what were they thinking when they saw it? They just weren't perceiving it the same way we were, And we were very simpatico, and we had a lot of psychic experiences together. I'm not saying the daughter didn't, but she was much younger, and she was so wanting to find this like nice place. But I remember having that experience. Is like, and we went inside, and there was like a door to the bathroom that somebody had smashed, and the people were trying to sell it, and even the mortgage, the real estate agent. It was a Sunday, almost like was sharing it, just like what I saw in the Amityville Horror in this remake, where the real estate agent was trying to sell to Ryan Reynolds and his wife this house, and she doesn't mention till the end, oh, by the way, there was this horrific murder there, a terrible
Mm-hmm.
tragedy, and then they decide to take it anyway. And I never watched the rest of that show, and I'm sure it turned out to be really, horrendous. But it's like, there were already these terrible things that happened there. And so just like, again, we have things like one of the things when you think about, the pipeline, even though, you know, I'm basically an environmentalist, the pipeline through the center of the United States, right?
Mhm.
The whole thing between Canada and Texas and so on. It's had all this controversy. Under Obama, Biden, they said, no, we don't want to do it. And the Native American kind of populations agreed with that. Then the oil people do want it. Then under Trump, they started up again, and now they're stopping it again. And there are all these issues now because a lot of people will lose their jobs. So the question is, pandemic, jobs versus environment, whatever. But here's the thing that's being forgotten. Aside from the environment, you got all of these tribes, right, of
Mhm.
hundreds of years of people with burial grounds. They don't always talk about that, and again, the Sioux, the whole thing with the history of this country, Battle of Little Bighorn, all these atrocities and other things with Native American tribes, this whole thing. So we have these ancestors, we have cemeteries, we have these places that have these energies. And unfortunately, we're such a materialistic culture, and every culture is different, of how it looks at its ancestors, and respects that and things like that. And again, with the pandemic, I know we probably have to end here, and I've been talking a lot, but the thing is, it's sad and frightening that so many people are dying without seeing their relatives. Stuff that we hear, the bodies are not going to the cemeteries, or you know, to be cremated and to be buried. And if you're not living in New York City or one of these big places and you're not privy to it, again, if you're in a rural community and not a lot is happening, you're thinking, what, this has got to be a hoax. It's like a TV show, some kind of horror thing. This couldn't possibly be happening. My problem or issue is that I'm born in New York City. My dad was a
Mhm.
doctor. He took me to all these hospitals, like when I'd go in the car as a little kid and I'd sit in the hospital when he would do, see his patients and so on.
Mhm.
And I know New York City is a very different place. And if somebody's not living in New York or San Francisco or Houston or a big city, and they're looking at things from a rural standpoint or from somewhere else, then they think maybe it's being exaggerated. It couldn't possibly be true. So we
Mhm.
have all these differences of opinion, and again, we have to live with it, because that's who we are as a species, to learn, to grow, but I appreciate so much being on your show. And I had no idea I would be sharing some of the things, but I appreciate you've asked me really good questions and at the heart and soul of astrology. So for people listening, I think they'll get a lot out of it, I hope. You know,
Thank you so much
we'll,
for being on. This was fabulous. I want to get you on again.
but I have to learn how to, from the get go, be upright. I'm going to have to turn it around. I still see my name upside down and I see your name. So we'll work on that. And
See,
I'll,
everything looks good to me on my end. See, everything's
well,
upright.
well, I think that's not just ironic, but as we use the word synchronistic, I think it's really, I mean, that's never happened before. And hopefully it's not going to happen again. But, it's
Sure.
interesting because I am often kind of conversant in looking at things like you asked about the Mercury retrograde, where I'm
Mhm.
as much a rebel in the astrology field, where I don't want things being taught where there isn't logic and
Right.
things that make sense. And Mercury retrograde and other, again, you never hear people saying, "Oh my God, Saturn, Neptune, and Pluto are all retrograde for 5 months." Nobody ever says it because it happens almost half the year. And if they said it, then they'd have to realize, well, why is the Mercury thing so difficult when we don't focus on Neptune being retrograde? And
Mhm.
then they would realize it's a solar systemic function of we're 93 million miles away. You have to think of it in terms of the larger picture of the sun and the cosmos and not just, oh, Mercury, let's blame that because my messages are being lost. I want to make Mercury into a convenient scapegoat for the fact that, like, my thoughts or my problems are like more intense for the last 3 weeks because Mercury's in reverse.
Gotcha.
But
Thank
anyway,
you so much for doing
you're
this. I
okay.
really appreciate it. Tell us
Well,
where we can find your books.
okay. Well, the main website is www.greatbear, like the animal, enterprises with an S.com. That has our complimentary sections, global hotspots about full moons and new moons, astro business keys to learn themes and archetypes about sun, moon, planets, asteroids, Chiron. And then we have Earth Aquarius News. The old name of our website is now the News Center. stories like JFK, nuclear, and all these other things. And then we have the astrology cosmic calendar with a K, that's an app for iPhones and Android phones, free 1 day at a time, of what's happening in the sky and all the alignments, or by subscription. It's not that expensive. Then we have, I have 36 1 hour now audio classes. Used to be on tape and then CD, and people can learn astrology, like beginner, intermediate, advanced, and lesson notes and things like that. So, and I used to have Welcome to Planet Earth magazine, and in my podcasts, that they're also on my website or Apple, Spotify. It's called Mark Lerner Astrology Astroscope, and I guess it's Astroscope is the main name under Mark Lerner, and I've done now 79 of these, all about different subjects: America, the world, coronavirus, Star Wars, as I said, psychic astrology, now getting into Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, almost anything under the sun, all different topics that I look at.
Fantastic. And I'm going to get a hold of your daughter after we get off, because I want to get you back on. I want to continue our conversation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Charlotte. I really appreciate it in this upside down world that we're living in now literally, because I've been seeing you upside down. You see, you're seeing me correctly again somehow.
Yeah, see, I'm totally across. Your name's right. Everything's fine.
Well, it's the thing on the iPad. I'll eventually figure it out, and maybe I'll be on the computer. I do have computers. They're just not right at the moment. Either one of them has a video issue or an audio issue, and I need to get my geek guy to come over and fix everything.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you have some time in April, I'd like to have you back on.
Great. Thank you. Contact my daughter, and I really appreciate it. Many blessings to you and all your listeners, and I'll really look forward to the next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
All right, that was Mark Lerner. That was something. That was pretty fun. I learned a lot. This was great, and I do want to get Mark back on, because there's a lot more I'd like to pick his brain about, because he's kind of leaning into what I do and vice versa, so it's kind of cool. On Wednesday, our guest will be Peter Lance, who's going to be talking about the Doris Duke case, and you guys can do some pre-research on that for me. But anyway, I thank you all for coming today, and this was really cool, and I can't wait to get Mark back on with us.